All right, good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's session on the Road to Zero, History and Personal Engagement, a session with Dr. George Miller. Before introducing our speaker, let me just set out a few words to set the context. As you all know, the testing issue is back in public and policy discussion. This follows a provocative of somewhat obscure statement by the president last autumn, and it's followed also by last week's formal allegations from the U.S. government about China and its ongoing activities. And this latest cycle of interest in whether and how to put limits on nuclear test activities, this latest cycle follows a long cycle. This issue has surfaced and resurfaced repeatedly in the American political discourse, the international political discourse. And what many current employees of the lab don't appreciate is the extent to which this laboratory has played a very important role in the evolution of U.S. policy in this area. And it's been a source of credible, which is rare in this particular topic, credible technical information that has informed policymaking and negotiation and decisions about whether or not to ratify the treaty. And the lab played a particularly noteworthy role in the long process that led through the negotiation to the signing of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And today, Dr. Miller will review this history with an eye to setting out some key insights based on personal engagement and some of the most significant events of that period. Our speaker, as you all know, is Dr. George H. Miller, Director Emeritus of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He arrived at the lab in 1972 as a postdoc with a PhD in physics from the College of William and Mary. As a design physicist in the Thermonuclear Design Division, he was responsible for 16 nuclear tests. In 1985, he became Associate Director for Nuclear Design, then Associate Director for Defense and Nuclear Technologies, then Associate Director for National Security, then Associate Director for NIF, and then having run out of things to name him Associate Director of, they made him Associate Director at Large, a position he occupied for approximately 5 years before becoming Laboratory Director in 2006, and he served in that role until his retirement in 2011. And like many laboratory veterans, he's flunked retirement. He's found ways to stay engaged, most significantly as a member of U.S. Strategic Command's Strategic Advisory Group, where he was appointed to lead a very interesting panel that looks at the cross-section of issues related to transformative new technologies and their impact on the strategic deterrence mission. Dr. Miller has received numerous awards and honors, including the John Foster Jr. Medal for contributions to U.S. national security, the National Nuclear Security Administration Gold Award, and the U.S. Department of the Air Force Distinguished Service Award. Before turning it over to George for his remarks, let me remind our online community of the rules of engagement. Our speaker will speak for approximately 45 minutes, uninterrupted by questions. And when he concludes, I will open it up for discussion from the floor. I will look for raised hands, electronic hands first, and we'll bring you into the discussion. So please ready to do that. Please raise your hand as he goes if you'd like. If you'd prefer to send something in the chat function, please send it to me and I'll try and get it into the conversation as time permits. We'll go 90 minutes unless our interest is exhausted before then. But thanks everybody for carving out the time to do this. Thank you, George, for taking this on our behalf. Pleasure to welcome you to CGSR. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Brad. This is going to be an unusual presentation for me in the sense that I usually like to have just a few cartoons and then talk. I thought on this subject, it's probably important to have the actual words. So I'll try to get through this. I also will barely touch the topics. Wave tops of a very complicated subject. And so there's a much richer history than I'm able to go through in the invited time. Okay, let's see if I can make it. There we go. One of my favorite little books is a book called Zero, looking at the history of the development of the concept of zero. And I was a little struck by how some of the concepts of developing zero actually have a parallel in what we're going to be talking about today. The history part comes from a laboratory book that was posthumously published by Paul Brown on the US's involvement in the comprehensive test ban talks up through 2000. My own personal involvement really started in about 1986 when shortly after becoming an associate director, and wrote a number of papers about nuclear testing and the results of what we were trying to do and what we were trying to accomplish. A caveat, I'm neither a historian nor an arms control expert, so I've received a lot of help, particularly from Ambassador Ron Lehman, and he has actually a companion talk that looks at the same subject from more of an arms control perspective. As Brad said, Livermore has provided, all three labs have really provided technical input to the very long process. And I think those of you who've thought about it a little bit realize that development and negotiation of any treaty is a very complex matter. It's very complicated, very dynamic, and very messy, with lots and lots of different countervailing and tensions that have to be dealt with. The lab is technically involved in all sides of this issue, and I think that's important, all the way from the weapon design and testing to arms control and verification. And I think, as everybody knows, the treaty was signed. It was not ratified by the US. It was ratified and then de-ratified by Russia, so it has not come into force. In establishing and developing treaties, there almost always is a very strong political overlay. This is an example from 1979, about the time I got seriously looking at a comprehensive test ban. So this is from President Carter's negotiation directions to the development of a comprehensive test ban. And again, keeping these criteria in mind is always an important part of thinking about a treaty and where it might be going. Interest in a nuclear test ban started almost with the beginning of the first nuclear tests. And the laboratory and its senior management have been involved in a very serious way. In fact, many of you may know that the man that we were named for, Ernest Lawrence, was at talks in Geneva when he got the diverticulitis that ultimately was his demise. So the lab and its senior managers have been involved for a very long time. And many of the issues, as you'll see, have been a part of the discussion from the very beginning. Again, one of the very first looks was done by the President's Science and Advisory Committee, looking at practical detection systems and the knowledge that nuclear tests can be decoupled even when they're done underground. And so, again, there have been a series of starts and stops. One of the longest moratoria prior to the one we're currently living in was in 1958 to 1961. The Soviets broke out of that moratorium with one of the largest test series that the world has seen. Following that breakout, public concern over radioactive fallout caused the Limited Test Ban Treaty to come into effect, which moved everything underground. The laboratory's perspectives on the nuclear test ban, I think, are well outlined in a 1956 letter from Lawrence and Teller. In my judgment, these perspectives continued to be part of the thought process associated with detection, with the fact that the state of knowledge about nuclear weapons was inadequate at that time, worrying about radioactivity and worrying about public safety. So these overarching themes, if you will, have been part of the conversation for a very long time. The next major treaty was the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and Peaceful Nuclear Explosive Treaty. I was a designer getting ready for this treaty to come into effect. It prohibited nuclear tests above 150 kilotons. Again, it also is an example of the difficulty associated with nuclear test ban treaties. Not too long after the treaty came into effect, there was expressed concern by the administration that the Russians were cheating. That is, they were testing above 150 kilotons. Because of the laboratory's deep engagement in seismic activities and its understanding of earth sciences, we did a very detailed evaluation. This is from a testimony by the director at the time, Roger Batesel, who said that it's clear that the Soviets are obeying a limit, and that based on probability, that limit is consistent with TTBT compliance. To further reduce the uncertainties, that resulted a few years later in the joint verification experiments, where we observed a test in Russia and they observed a test in the US, and the calibration methods was a cortex. In Livermore, we call it a slifer, and Los Alamos calls it a cortex, basically a cable that you stick down hole and watch it short as the explosion moves up the ground. That was to help calibrate the two test sites. I'll also notice, and this will come up again as we move forward in concerns about the viability of a test moratorium. This is from a talk that I gave to Mike May when he was Associate Director at Large on what I thought we could do under 150 kiloton limit. And Mike brought up the very important point that it really is about designers and their judgments. And he was worried about our ability to sustain that even back in the 1970s under 150 kiloton limit. Throughout the 80s, there were numerous congressional inquiries into the viability of a comprehensive test ban. In 1987, the Congress asked Director Batesel to have Ray Kidder write a paper on nuclear weapons testing during low yield thresholds. Roger certainly obliged. Also had a companion paper that was authored by myself, Paul Brown, and Carol Alonso on a similar subject, on the same subject. The two reports differed significantly on whether or not nuclear testing was necessary at that time. And I think that's, again, characteristic of the connection of the laboratory to the University of California. And that is, there's a free and open discussion of all of the different points of view. Our report also expanded on an earlier report by Jack Rosengren on historical stockpile issues, particularly the experience following the moratorium. This paper and those examples have been used many times since. And I think you'll see towards, as I get further along, it is obvious that these examples are all from the very early history of the nuclear weapons program and don't necessarily represent the level of understanding that we have today. I presented the results of our paper in follow-on congressional testimony. This is from the testimony. What I said in summary was that we were not ready today, and this is 1986, for significantly reduced nuclear test limits, but that we were taking steps to prepare for more restrictive test limitations. Again, a hallmark of the laboratory. We respond to the political system, and it's our job to be ready for whatever their decisions might be. Again, my personal experiences as a nuclear weapon designer led me to believe that it was important to pursue weapons physics on lasers, because many of the things that I was interested in knowing were very difficult to observe in an underground environment. Much of the arms control discussions following the TTBT were about what is euphemistically called a step-by-step approach. That is, building on the success of the TTB and enhanced verification methods to look at successively lower thresholds. And everything from 100 kilotons to 1 kilogram were looked at during that time. Harold Brown strongly advocated for a permanent 3 to 5 kiloton limit that would allow continued confidence, but strongly limit vertical proliferation. Many of the NPT signatories favored limiting a Big Bang. That, of course, was never decided on what Big Bang actually meant, unlike the TV show. There were several failed attempts legislatively to mandate a comprehensive test ban, but there was no defined agreement on what was to be banned. So by the early 1990s, much of the debate became much more heated. It became sufficiently heated that the George H.W. Bush administration expressed strong opposition to a legislatively enacted test moratorium, but did decide administratively to limit the number and the yield of nuclear tests. Again, with a significant reduction in the overall yield, most of which would be done about 15 kilotons. This, for example, led to the cancellation of the most extensively diagnosed X-ray laser test. In 1992, the Hatfield-Exon-Mitchel amendment was signed into law by President Bush, establishing a 9-month moratorium, followed by a limit of 15 nuclear tests, with all nuclear tests ceasing by September 30th, 1996, and mandated that a comprehensive test ban be negotiated. President Bush reluctantly signed the bill because it also was connected to building the superconducting collider, which was supposed to be built in Texas. He intended to change the law when he was reelected. Of course, he was not reelected. In a similar time frame, the cooperation between the U.S. and Russia began with the end of the Cold War. I participated in almost all of those discussions in the early years. In one of the discussions, we were talking about a CTBT, and the Russians told me that if the nuclear yield was less than the high explosive yield, it wasn't a nuclear explosion. If the US couldn't detect it at a distance, it wasn't a nuclear test. And they also said that they regularly conducted hydronuclear tests as part of their development and certification process, and would likely continue to do them. So there was a series of steps that led from this point forward to the CTBT. In the spring of '93, Bruce Tarter called a group together to lay out the basis of a weapons program with no nuclear tests. Larry Woodruff and I presented this to Vic before he became Assistant Secretary. These initiatives led to the formation of the Stockpile Stewardship Program under Vic's very, very important and very strong leadership. In the spring of '93, there was a series of classified briefings to the new secretary. I gave the briefing on what we would do with the 15 tests and an outline of the program without nuclear tests. President Clinton in '93 decided to extend the moratorium and to develop a program for maintaining confidence in the safety, reliability, and performance of our nuclear weapons. The tests that were proposed by the National Laboratory to be conducted during a 9-month moratorium, a stockpile confidence test for each system in the stockpile, development of insensitive high explosives for those systems that didn't have them, optimization of warhead performance and manufacturability. This eventually became the RRW idea. Tests to understand our basic gaps in knowledge, and tests to understand the potential of proliferant designs. The DoD only supported the stockpile confidence tests, and in particular, the Navy was worried about the development of IHE on its own systems. About the same time, Vic formed a group called the Navigators to help develop the Stockpile Stewardship Program. It included 3 people from the weapons program, myself, John Emily, and Roger Hagen-Gruber. 3 science people, Dick Fortner from this lab, John Brown and Jerry Jonas, and Steve Cadiz from the production. This is a set of quotes from Vic following a series of workshops that he held at each of the labs. And he so correctly as always pointed out the importance of the health and vitality of the laboratory and the quality of its technical staff. In parallel, there was a review of the federal labs, the entire federal lab system. Secretary O'Leary asked John Galvin from Motorola to chair the task force. They had 2 strong recommendations: 1, to corporatize the labs, and 2, to eliminate Livermore's nuclear weapons design capability, with only enough to allow a look at non-proliferation, counter-proliferation intelligence. So much of the discussion over the next few years was in the context of what was Livermore's role in the nuclear weapons program going to be. There was congressional testimony. Secretary O'Leary said she was favorably disposed. Vic very strongly supported this laboratory and pointed out how important it was, if you're not going to do nuclear testing, to have peer review. Dr. Sid Drell, who was chairman of the UC President's Council, had similarly strong words in favor of maintaining Livermore's expertise. In the summer of '95, there were 4 really significant events that led to the ultimate decision to negotiate a comprehensive test ban. There was a Jason study. There was a nuclear symposium, often called the Confidence Conference. There were meetings with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the President's National Security Advisory Council, and then a telephone call from the NSC to the lab directors. The Jason report was particularly important. It's worth noting that much of the report was driven by nuclear weapons experts, in particular Seymour Sack from this laboratory, John Richter from Los Alamos, and Bob Purifoy from Sandia. Basically said that we have confidence today that we must provide support there's a range of performance margins that testing, even at a level of 500 tons, would have to be done on a continuing basis, that lower yields were not of particular value, and that the problems that occurred in the past, which either relied on or required nuclear tests, were due mainly to the limited knowledge and computational capabilities. This is a reference to the comment that I made about the examples that were included in the 1996 paper that I was co-author on. There was a confidence conference chaired by Admiral Hank Childs at Stratcom with senior managers from the Department of Energy, Defense, and the senior managers from the nuclear weapons laboratories. This is the talks that were given. I gave the overview. The most important talk, as you'll see in a minute, was from Mike Anastasio, but we covered the full range of conversations about the nuclear weapons program and the approach that was being taken to maintain confidence without nuclear testing. My talk was largely unclassified so that there would be a record that could be used in other forum. This is the summary, again, following actually very similar to the recommendations of the Jason report, that the stockpile was judged to be safe and secure at that time, that there would be decline if you don't do anything, that the stockpile stewardship program could mitigate the decline, and a modest program of 510 tests would provide important confidence and reduce risks. This is sort of how we thought about it, that the 500-ton tests are particularly important as the transition to stockpile stewardship was made, because there would be a vulnerability between when we stopped testing and when the advanced capability came on board. And so this was, again, these are slides that were shown at the confidence conference. This is how we looked at a so-called stoplight chart of how we looked at capability to have confidence without nuclear, with the current capability, with nothing, without stockpile stewardship, with a successful, with hydronuclear, with 500 tons, and if we had full capability. And so this, in a classified forum, was the basis of Mike Anastasio's talk. He went through about an hour and a half of technical details about why these were the conclusions, and that was also the basis for the conversation with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and with the President's National Security Advisor. Within Livermore and Los Alamos, there was a disagreement about the value of hydronuclear. Even within Livermore, there were some that thought it was that it had utility. The majority of Livermore, myself included, did not believe that they had significant value. Secretary Lirio wrote the president and said she did not endorse hydronuclear. Again, these disagreements were fully aired in all of the technical discussions that led up to the CTBT. For the confidence conference, all of those presentations were given, and then there was an executive session. I was not in the executive session. Bruce Tarter was, and this is from his book, basically saying as technical people, we could not guarantee success, but that we were optimistic that the stockpile stewardship program could be successful. Following that conference, there was a series of meetings that I've described. Again, Mike Anastasio was the technical briefer. They included Charlie Curtis and the 3 lab directors. Vic chose not to attend so as not to put any additional pressure on the lab directors. Shortly later, I briefed Secretary of Defense William Cohen on the same subject. Bruce, again, was asked if he could endorse the president's desire for a CTBT, and he said he could endorse it as long as the very robust stewardship program was put into place. Shortly thereafter, all three lab directors were independently polled by the National Security Council about whether or not they could endorse a comprehensive test ban. And so again, on 1995, the president made the decision to negotiate a true zero and establishing a set of safeguards, including the development of the Stockpile Stewardship Program. Shortly thereafter, the president decided that the continued vitality of all three DOE nuclear labs was essential in maintaining safety, reliability of the stockpile, and Secretary O'Leary agreed with that statement and put it forward again, firmly reestablishing that Livermore is a national defense laboratory. So now the negotiation of the CTB and the issues that had to be resolved, deciding what had to be banned was very complicated. Comprehensive can mean a very broad set of things, including such things as hydrodynamic tests, since yield itself has no practical meaning. And in fact, true zero is just a lower threshold. There were many people who actually wanted to ban fusion also. Dick Garwin, for instance, wanted to limit ICF to 10 to the 14th neutrons. That was not something that the US agreed to, nor the Japanese, nor the Germans, nor the P5. But the major issue is verification and the full range of questions about how do you detect, identify, attribute, assess, and enforce verification at very, very low yields. In negotiation, what the treaty says is important. This is what the preamble to the CTBT says, trying to constrain development and quality of nuclear weapons and the development of advanced new types. And second of all, not to carry out nuclear weapon test explosion or any other nuclear explosion. And as everybody is aware, that was not defined in the treaty. So the negotiating record, these are statements from Ambassador Ledegar, who was the US ambassador and chief negotiator, in that he noted that there was a lot of discussion early in the talks about lower thresholds with yields up to perhaps 10 tons. He was clear. It's been a long time since I've actually read the negotiating record, but my remembrance is that that the negotiating record did agree that hydronuclear that produce nuclear yield would be banned. Now, of course, the question then becomes, what's the legally binding issue in a treaty? Is it the negotiating record? Is it the treaty? Is it the State Department interpretation or the Senate deliberations? So there's a lot of issues that go along with these kinds of treaties. I will note that, again, representatives of all of the labs were in Geneva from this lab. Bill Dunlop was present as part of the technical backstopping committee that helped the ambassador and the negotiators themselves with the complicated technical issues. During the ratification hearings in 1999, Bruce Tarter said a sustained and strongly supported SSP has an excellent chance of ensuring. Again, he didn't guarantee it. As technical people, we could not guarantee it. Director Batesel, former Director Batesel, in response to a request for information, urged that they oppose it. John Knuckles, also former director, said that without nuclear testing, confidence will decline. So again, a full airing of all of the different perspectives as the Senate considered the ratification of the treaty itself. Virtually from the beginning, there has been concern about the compliance with the zero yield standard. Again, the compliance is at some level complicated because since the treaty never came into force, the issue is actually with the TTBT because you're obliged to tell anybody and announce any nuclear explosive test. And the Russians have not announced any. So the legal issue is with the TTB. And then, of course, the question of are they maintaining strict agreement with the U.S. zero yield definition. These are from U.S. State Department assessments. This is from the 2020 assessment. The U.S. finds that Russia has conducted a nuclear yield that's not consistent with zero yield, and that China has maintained a high level of activity, and their lack of transparency makes it difficult to know what they've actually done. But it has raised concerns with adherence to the zero yield standard. So when all of this, when we sort of try to start thinking about wrapping this up, I think it's important to understand that from my perspective, there is no risk-free approach. Even with nuclear weapons testing, when we regularly did them, we took risks, and there were risks. And part of that is because of the nature of a nuclear weapon. With very few exceptions, no nuclear stockpile test weapon was ever tested in anything that resembles the way it was intended to be used. Compromise had to be made to do a nuclear test, particularly underground. Nuclear weapons tests were never certified by tests. Tests were a piece of the database, but they were often not even the most important part of the process. That certification is a statement of confidence and the judgment of technical experts based upon a rigorous process that considered all of the data. And so I think it's important as we talk about the controversies that continue to roll around in this area to remember the backdrop. In many respects, the approach we're taking today is no different than it was when we could do nuclear tests. It's just we're relying on the data from past nuclear tests. There's a whole bunch of articles that discuss all of these things. There's a report, this first one was actually authored by Ron Lehman, but there's a whole series of reports, the Jason report. The summary of the Jason report is unclassified. The full report is classified. There is a report by Johnny Foster and Harold Agnew in '99. There have been some more recent papers, one by John Hopkins and David Sharp of Los Alamos. The paper that I just quoted by Brad, that's in a CGSR volume edited by Brad. Recent paper by Michael Schneider, an op-ed by Sig Hecker, a recent paper published by myself. It's an internal lab paper, and then a recent paper published by Keith Payne. So there's a lot of opinions, a lot of points of view that have been expressed over the years on these subjects. So in conclusion, in the epilogue that I wrote to Paul Brown's book, I tried to remind people that there are three themes that I think are important to understanding the laboratory's evolution and what the lab directors have said about nuclear testing and stockpile stewardship and its attendant risks. The first that I mentioned a couple of times is the culture of academic freedom. That's derived from the lab's long association with UC and other like-minded universities. the complicated interaction of threats and technology and policy, and the fact that knowledge continues to grow, and the critical but often unstated tension between risk and confidence. They are not the same. Even when you have confidence, you are still taking risks. And that in development of a treaty involves very complicated judgments amongst the participating signatories. Our job at the laboratory is to provide the very best technical insight and advice that we can, and let the political system make the decisions. So my summary, I'm just about on my 45-minute limit. The road to zero was long, over 4 decades, very winding. I think this is a really important point. Key presidential decisions were thoroughly debated with a strong technical component. And the role of the laboratory has been critical in understanding the interaction of threats and technology and policy. And as we see, the zero yield world continues to be very rocky, as doubts about the Russian and Chinese compliance, as confidence in the capability of SSP declines for some, and as the call for new U.S. nuclear capability increases. So I'm reasonably sure we have not heard the end of this story. So with that, I will conclude and turn it back over to you, Brad.